Cool. Yes. Cool. I'm labbed up. Just burrow right in here.
What? This is muted. This is how I talk. No. So coming up next, this is Ted Harrington, and we're doing Hackers and Attack Anatomy. So this should be some good stuff, and it's ISE, right? So Ted should have some good stuff for us here. Also, I do want to remind everybody, we are going to be having some fundraisers here for a kids conference that's going to be put on. So we're arresting hackers. So if you're interested to watch a hacker pick their way out of lockpicks, or out of handcuffs rather, maybe come and see me. I'll tell you how we can do that. And we've also got the drunk talks tonight, birds of a feather, and whose slide is it anyway? So if you're up for some drunken debauchery, please don't hesitate to sign up. It's a good time. And with that, I'll get out of the way and let Ted go.
Thanks. All right. Cool. Well, pleasure to be here, guys. So, as he was mentioning, my name is Ted Harrington. I'm executive partner at Independent Security Evaluators. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're most commonly recognized as the first company to hack the iPhone. We went on to have some other high-profile attacks, some of which we'll talk about in this presentation. But that one, even though that was many, many years ago, we still get phone calls all the time about that. So what I'm going to talk about today is I talk at conferences all over the country to primarily a business audience. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, it's very difficult to translate these highly technical, complex concepts that we're always working on every day to an executive who has really no technical ability. You know, the CEO generally doesn't come up out of a coding background, for instance. And so translating to them how to make decisions that impact their business is something that I'm on a crusade to do. And so what I'm going to talk about is how I talk to CEOs and other executives about security, and hopefully you guys can glean some insight into ways to talk about the thing that we're all passionate about, because fundamentally, dollars talk. And executives also don't necessarily always know exactly what they're talking about, and so it's up to us to help them become empowered to really make great decisions. So why is this important? This is a question that I think anyone should ask of any speaker ever, is why am I sitting here and listening to this? And so one of the things that's really important when we look at the ecosystem that we're all playing in today, the world of security, we look at, there's some really interesting things happening. You've got the attackers themselves are very, very sophisticated. The attack vectors are becoming, they're very evolved. Digital assets themselves are becoming more and more valuable. You've got companies that are largely or entirely dependent on technology. And so this creates this potential opportunity for chaos for a business. But of course, talking about FUD doesn't really help anybody. So what we always want to keep in mind too is that there are actually practical things that businesses can do in order to defend against these highly sophisticated adversaries that we see today. So what I'm going to do, how I'm going to structure this talk, is we're going to talk about a series of attacks. We're going to break down at a high level how they worked, and then we're going to extract from them the business lesson and how executives can implement things to become more resilient. So the first one we'll talk about is Texas Instruments. So this is actually a story about the birth of our company. We were born in 2005 out of the Information Security Institute at Johns Hopkins. Anybody familiar with that particular program? Okay. So it's a PhD in computer science, but specifically with a focus on information security, as the name would suggest. And so at the time, in 2005, we my business partner, 2 of his colleagues in the program, and the director of the program wanted to study some RFID systems and set up a lab to do so. And the emphasis was that if we were successful in breaking some high-profile systems, there might be some commercial interest, and so maybe we should put a company together. And so we started with the Texas Instruments DST-40. The reason that we chose this, there were 2 main reasons that we chose this particular system to study first. One was, at the time, 2005, this was considered unbreakable. And I put that in air quotes because I think everyone in this room would be smart enough to never say that about anything ever. And especially if you say that to a bunch of hacker-minded computer scientists, they're going to say, challenge accepted. The second reason is that this system powered 2 really important use cases, very high-profile use cases. One is the immobilizer function of Ford Motors ignition keys. So there's, of course, the physical turnover. You stick your key in the ignition. It turns the ignition over, but there's also a communication relay between the onboard computer and the key that says, is this the authentic key? If so, I'll turn the car on, and if not, then I will kill the switch. So there's obvious implications there for theft, for personal safety, and obviously Ford, very well-known brand, widely deployed devices. ExxonMobil was another use case of this same system, the ExxonMobil Speed Pass in particular. And ExxonMobil Speed Pass is it's a little dongle that goes on your keychain, it connects to your credit card, and so you can pump gas by just wanding it. Obvious payment implications there. And so what we did was we set out to study the system, and these are the images of the use case. So we set out to study this. Took about 2 weeks to reverse engineer the cryptographic algorithm. A couple more weeks, we had a non-functioning prototype. Turns out there was a small piece of error-correcting code that was preventing our prototype in the lab from working out in the field. And then a few weeks later, we had resolved that last piece, and we had a fully functional radio. And so we proved concept by inviting several news outlets to come watch us demonstrate it. And what we did was we started a Ford with a key that we had made at Lowe's in front of them for $1.25. And we started that car, and we drove it to an ExxonMobil station, and we pumped free gas. So sure enough, there was a ton of commercial interest, and every major news outlet wrote about it: USA Today, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. The list goes on, and companies came calling. And so that's how we were born out of that particular attack. What was interesting about that is we've grown now into a very sophisticated commercial enterprise class consulting firm, where still about 20% of our time is that type of research, where we're just looking at a system and trying to find out what are the vulnerabilities with it in order to advance some particular cause. And the other 80%, enterprises actually hire us to say, here's our system, here's access to everything, source code, you name it, and tell us not just can you defeat it in one way, but what are all the ways that an interested bad guy would compromise everything and help us develop some mitigation strategies. So the next one that we'll talk about, show of hands here, who has not heard of the target breach? Okay. All right, so good. I was worried there was going to be even one hand. So obviously this is a very well publicized, very well documented case study. What's really, really interesting about it is that we can really talk about some specifics. I don't know about you guys, but in my career, we've seen so many systems that impact so many people, but we're not allowed to talk about the vulnerabilities we've seen in it for reasons of non-disclosure. And in this case, we can actually break down how the attack worked and extract some lessons from it. So in the case of Target, again, keep in mind that this presentation is intended to talk to a business audience. And so I take the way I describe things to a very high level. And so anyone who's studied this attack can be much more specific about some of the details that I'll talk about, but to a business person, that's actually not important. What's important is the conceptual approach of how that it worked. So fundamentally, the attackers, through a spear phishing campaign, were able to obtain some credentials of the HVAC vendor. The HVAC vendor had remote access to Target's network environment for reasons of monitoring energy consumption, making sure that the stores were the appropriate temperature when the store would open, so that if it's too hot or too cold and customers can't come in the door, then can't make money. And so it makes sense that this HVAC vendor would have this remote access. But what they should not have is access to the payment environment. But the attackers, once they had the credentials and were in, using the authentic credentials, were able to jump from the maintenance environment into the payment environment, install the RAM scraper malware that basically just copied digits that looked consistent with credit card numbers, and copied those to a text file, basically. And anyone who's familiar with PCI or the way credit card transactions works knows that credit cards are encrypted virtually all of the time. But virtually is not entirely. And there is that millisecond when they're decrypted to perform the transaction, at which time the malware would copy that string. Now, once they had this file, this growing file of data, the next challenge was exfiltrating the data. And what they did was really interesting. They leveraged NetBIOS, which allows systems that don't normally talk to each other to communicate. And so using that, mixed in with authentic authentic communication, these files were moved around in the network to an area where they could be exfiltrated without setting off any alarms, and then dumped to compromised servers all around the world where the attackers could then go retrieve them. So what is the lesson that business executives can take out of this? Well, primarily it's that we should be securing assets and not just perimeters. So traditionally, defenses have focused on hardening the perimeter and making sure that the bad guys stay out and don't get in. And that is a worthwhile approach, but it no longer works against modern attacks because modern attacks now originate from within trusted boundaries. So in a traditional way, attacks worked primarily against three vectors. You attack your people, you attack the physical facility, or you attack via connected devices. Forgot one point. So to defend against that, you train your people, you put up physical implementations, things like security guards, and then you put up firewalls and things like that to harden your perimeter from an external attack. But in today's environments, third-party systems are so integrated into an infrastructure that there really is no distinction as clearly between external and internal. And so the way that a modern attacker will compromise a system is through a stepping stone. They'll go after a startup or some smaller company who hasn't necessarily invested the resources in security, use them as the vehicle to get into the true victim, and then from there, they're now behind trusted boundaries, and in many systems, there is the ability to go anywhere else in the network once you're inside. And that's more or less what happened in the case of Target. And so what we're always advising companies to do to defend against that is to build layers of defense in depth. So if we think about your environment right now today, if there was a bad guy in it, as we're speaking, what would he have access to? And so that mindset of thinking that they're in today, well, now I'm going to firewall off my most valuable assets away from other assets and make it difficult internally for an adversary to move from one area to the next. That's how we thwart or at least make it more difficult for an adversary to perform attacks like this. So the next attack that we're going to talk about, I can't actually mention the particular company by name, but I can talk about the metrics that we were able to pull out of it. So I can't talk about that name because they were a customer of ours, and obviously non-disclosures are preventing us from talking about that, but they are a secure chipset manufacturer, a major secure chipset manufacturer. And they came to us and they said they really wanted us to do a black box penetration test. So show of hands, who here is a penetration tester? Okay, so just a few. Who here is familiar with the concept of penetration testing? Okay, pretty much everybody. All right. So they came to us and they said, we want to do a black box penetration test. And we said, why? And they said, we want to understand what can an adversary do, or what is the likelihood that they can obtain, what's the likelihood that they can defeat our defenses? And we said, okay, well, that isn't really what you want. What you actually need is a white box vulnerability assessment. And we had some back and forth. We negotiated on it. Ultimately, they wouldn't give, and we wound up agreeing to do both. To do first a black box test, which is something that we very strongly advise against, and then a white box assessment, which is what we generally do. Though we didn't want to do the black box, and I'll get into that in a minute, the distinction between the two, the reason that we were actually okay with this particular case is we knew it would give us some really good metrics to talk about. And again, as we're talking, sort of taking a step back from this talk and making a comment about why we say things in a certain way, numbers are what drive executives. So we always want to talk about, when we're talking about security, talk about metrics, talk about financial ramifications, either financial upside or financial downside. Those are the things that make executives tick. So in this case, we were willing to do this type of review in order to get some of those metrics in a side-by-side comparison. So the reason that black box penetration tests are not good and white box vulnerability assessments are good is that the results that you get from a black box test are in fact incomplete. So if you find certain issues, it does not mean you found all of the issues. If you don't find any issues, that does not mean that no issues exist. So when an executive is looking for a risk calculation, what they want to do is they want to be empowered to make a decision. They want to be able to say, are my assets safe in this system? To what degree are they safe? Understanding that nothing is completely resilient. And if the acceptable risk meets their criteria, they'll use the system. If the risk is too high, they won't. You cannot achieve that proper risk calculation with a black box test. So I have a white paper that explains in pretty clear detail the distinction between these two. I'd be happy to email it to anybody who's interested. So I'll keep it higher level, but primarily the difference between a black box penetration test and a white box vulnerability assessment comes down to a few things. So one is the methodology. There's a difference between white box and black box, and that's all about knowledge and access level. So in the case of black box, you only have external information. Publicly available information, maybe it's on a marketing website. You test various inputs, see what the output is, progress the attack in that way. In the white box scenario, you have access to everything, from source code to design documents to engineers. You just have full system knowledge, insight into how the pieces work. As far as the evaluation type itself, the difference between penetration test and vulnerability assessment boils down to objective. So in the case of a penetration test, the purpose is to determine a binary outcome. Can I or can I not circumvent the defenses? In a vulnerability assessment, the objective is to understand complete understanding of where the vulnerabilities are and to determine mitigation strategies for each of them that harmonize with the business purpose of the system. So an example that I always like to give that sort of paints the picture in a little more concrete way is the example of the castle. So show of hands, who here is a fan of Game of Thrones? Okay, your hand went up extremely fast, so I suppose I should give you these. I have to give them out at some point. So, okay, I don't know. Did you guys see that that guy paid 20 grand to get killed in the next book? There's the author put out a fundraising campaign that said, for this charity, if you spend whatever amount of money, I will write your name into a book and I will kill you in a very gruesome way. And so then ostensibly we would be in the future chapters of the show. So anyway, we can imagine, so if we're familiar with castles, we're familiar with Game of Thrones, even if you're not familiar with Game of Thrones, you're familiar with the concept of a castle. And so in the scenario of a black box penetration test, the example would be the king wants to understand how secure is his kingdom. How secure is the castle, excuse me. And so what he does is he sends his carrier pigeon off to his cousin a few kingdoms away, and he says, hey, can you send your best and brightest knights over and see if they can get in? So the cousin knight sends his best knights, they come over, they spend a few days getting in, and they come back to the king with a report, and they say, you're good to go, you're secure. We found that you have a moat, there's alligators in it, the drawbridge was drawn, you had archers on the turrets, you had the hot oil guys spilling down the sides, so we couldn't get in, you're secure. So the king goes to bed that night, and he's so confident he tells his king's guard to not guard his bedroom door because he has this amazing report that says he's so secure. And in the morning, the kingdom wakes up to find the king is dead. His head has been cut off by their enemies. And everyone says, how is this possible? We just had this security review that says we're secure. Because there was a blind spot in the review. So in this mock example, there was a secret egress point through the sewer for the king in the event of a siege, so he could get out to a nearby field and wouldn't have to starve like everyone else in his kingdom. Well, the testers didn't know that that existed, thus it was not accounted for in their particular test. So in a contrasting example, a white box assessment, the king would have said, he would have brought in some of those outside guards, but he would have brought in his own guards too. He would have brought in his engineers and his architects and people who helped build the castle, and they would have looked at the plans, and they would have identified all the same things. Well, you got a moat, you've got alligators in it, you've got the archers on the turrets, you've got the hot oil, but what is this egress point? It's intended to be an egress point, but could it be repurposed as an ingress point? Now the king can still make the decision to not do anything about it if he wants to. He could accept that risk, but he's now empowered with the full amount of data to make that decision. And that's a really key and fundamental difference between the two approaches. So now if we take a step back and we look at the metrics, coming back to the example of the chipset manufacturer. So what we did was we took these two tests side by side, and we did 2 months of black box, and we did 2 months of white box in series. And the numbers were pretty compelling. So in the black box portion, we found 4 potential issues. Of those 4 issues, 2 issues the customer already knew about. So all that time we spent investigating them, the customer already knew about them. It was fundamentally a waste. One of the issues was a misunderstanding of how the system worked. Again, keep in mind, black box means that you have no inside knowledge. We didn't actually know why an input was producing an output. And then the 4th was, in fact, a confirmed vulnerability. We were not able to provide any recommendations because we didn't know under the hood how everything worked. And so fundamentally, what our customer came away with after that 8-week period was 200 man-hours produced 1 vulnerability and no mitigation strategy to solve it. So then we moved into the white box portion. Again, same system, same amount of resources and time. And what we found were, we found 11 issues pretty much within the first 7 days. These are all, by the way, I narrowed this down to just critical or high severity issues. The lower level issues that would require a daisy chain of attacks or very sophisticated skill level or inside knowledge or a combination of all that are actually excluded from these numbers. So there are additional things. But what we found by the end of it was we actually confirmed 21 issues. It's the same system. We only found 1 in the black box scenario. And we're able to advise at least 1 mitigation strategy per issue. So now our customer had all the strategies, had the full knowledge, and their cost per issue, instead of 200 hours for 1 issue, was more like 9 hours per issue. And so we can attach financial cost to that, and it's a compelling metric to any executive. So the next attack to talk about is some research that we've done. Who here is aware of the router research that ISC has been doing? Okay, so 1. Who here is aware of the fact that small office, home office routers are ridiculously vulnerable? Okay, I'm in the right place. So we set out to study this because, as I think everyone in this room has known for probably a long time, they're not a very secure type of device. And so we set out with a mission to, let's go identify some vulnerabilities so then we can go back to the manufacturers and say, hey, here's some research we did. You guys have issues. Let's drive some change. Let's protect our consumers. Let's empower consumers. And so the objective was we were going to go out. We were going to study the 10 most popular small office, home office routers, all the ones you get at Best Buy and the top-rated ones on Amazon and things like that. And our hope was to identify issues in about a third of them. We felt if we got above that, that would really be a success, that would really get some attention. So we went out, and actually the results were pretty staggering. We expanded the scope of the project to actually the 13 most popular routers instead of 10. And what we found was we broke every single one. Every single of the most popular routers are susceptible to a remote adversary, a local adversary, or both. This probably isn't coming as a surprise to this particular room. What came as a surprise to us was that after the fact, we went through responsible disclosure with all of the manufacturers, submitted them what the issues were, how to fix it, or at least a recommended approach to how to fix it. And that was, so we've done 2 studies, all in last year, starting in April. Here we are, it's June of 2014, and nothing has changed. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But the 2 attacks that we found were really different and interesting in different ways. So the first was some of the routers are able to be attacked remotely. And so the concept is someone in their office or their lair, wherever they are on the other side of the world, can attack me in my home office on the beach. And I'm based out of San Diego, so that's what my office looks like. And it's as simple as all they have to get me to do is to click a malicious link. And the routers themselves have no defense against what would be happening on that malicious link, and now they completely control all the network traffic. What's potentially scarier is actually the local attack. And so the local attack is what we call point-click-kill. And so this is as simple as an attacker can walk into your Starbucks or wherever there's public Wi-Fi. They run a tool to determine what type of router is powering that Wi-Fi. And then they cross-reference it with a registry of attacks. Now that ours has been out for well over a year, this would be one, or others. The other researchers have gotten into this too. And then they just run the automated attack. There's no defense against it, and what makes it a little scarier is no user interaction is needed. Not that humans are in any way the most secure part of any system, but at least there is that one extra step in the other attack. And this, there is none. And so the worst case scenario that we had articulated to the router manufacturers, and then at all the talks we gave at Black Hat and DEF CON and DerbyCon and all the conferences that we've been talking about it since, is that there could be a self-propagating worm that would just go from router to router. And earlier this year, actually in March, it happened, as this headline first reported. So what is the takeaway from that doom and gloom story about why routers are just terrible? The challenge is that the router manufacturers have prioritized functionality over security. And this is a very, very consistent theme across all businesses. And the theme is that security and functionality should actually be separated into distinct operations. Most companies see them as IT. Security is not IT. Security should be security, IT should be IT, and they should actually be separate. And what it fundamentally comes down to is conflict. Conflict is a very good thing within an organization when it's between teams rather than within a team. So an example, if we take a step out of IT for a minute, and we talk about somewhere else in an organization where conflict is good, a really good conflict is between Chief Marketing Officer and Chief Financial Officer. Chief Marketing Officer, if you didn't have a CFO, might say, here's this great conference I want to go to. I'm going to spend $100,000 on a booth and steak dinners and all these things. And, well, what do you know? I write my own check. I'm going to do it. Well, the purpose of the CFO is to say, hold on, before we write that check, prove to me why this is the best use of money for our customers and for our business. And so what that does is that facilitates dialogue. So the outcome of that dialogue might in fact be that, yes, we should spend this $100,000. It might even be we should spend more. Or it might be that we should spend less. But whatever the outcome is the best outcome for the organization. So when we look, moving back into the security aspect of it, security and functionality have different priorities. So security cares about things like protecting assets. What does access control look like? Defense in depth. Your functionality team cares about things like user experience and on-time delivery and performance. None of those overlap. And so when those are in the same team, naturally prioritization has to happen. And what's going to happen is 9 times out of 10, the functionality priorities are going to be numbers 1, 2, and 3, and the security priorities are going to be 4, 5, and 6. We see it time and time again. Okay, so the next attack we'll talk about is Snapchat. So show of hands, who here uses Snapchat? It's aimed at teenagers, guys. I'm always curious to see who raises their hand to that, because I feel like you should probably also like the Twilight vampire movies and things like that. But that's neither here nor there. So what's interesting about Snapchat, I'm not going to focus so much on the privacy issues of Snapchat. Those are well documented. There's a lot of security around it. But what's interesting is the ability through Snapchat to actually obtain information that can then be used in other attacks. And so Snapchat last year was in fact hacked. And what was hacked specifically was their Add a Friend feature. And so what they did, this was December of 13, they rolled out a feature that basically says, let's upload all of your contacts to Snapchat. Snapchat will spit back to you who are Snapchat users. And then with a click of a button, you can add them, and now your buddies are sending dick pics to each other, and you're good to go. Which is pretty much what Snapchat's for, I'm pretty sure. So, the problem is they were in such a rush to push this out that they failed to put on the proper protections. And so what winds up happening is you're supposed to upload your contacts to the server, the Snapchat server, and the server will come back with who are the Snapchat users of who you know and you submitted to Snapchat. Well, they didn't put any sort of rate limiting on. And so what the attackers were able to do was just upload a massive database of all the phone numbers in, say, the 617 area code. And then Snapchat spit back all of the user information. And so what the attackers were able to obtain with that was things like the username. And so most people use the same username across services. Attached to that username is an actual name and a phone number. And so now, for anyone who was in the session right before this, where they're talking about social engineering, you have a very powerful few pieces of data to go social engineer pretty much every other account. And so what is the key lesson that we can take away here from a business level? And it's the fundamental security paradigm that I talk about till I'm blue in the face, and I'm sure you guys do too, or hopefully you do. The idea of building security in, not just bolting it on. Most companies are in such a rush. This is sort of an extension of security versus functionality, but most companies are in such a rush to get the product out the door, or upgrade the iteration, or release the new feature, that security is sort of the last step. And we field calls all the time that are, so we just finished our 6-month development on the new system, and we're ready to go live next week. Can you quickly make sure there's no security issues? And we have to laugh because it takes many, many, many weeks to really do this right, plus your own mitigation time. But it's a starting point. We usually work then into the next release. But when we look at it from a financial perspective, building security in actually winds up being less expensive. So who here is familiar with this graph? Okay. So the concept of this graph basically says that addressing a bug that was, say, a requirements bug, the later that it is identified, the more expensive it is in terms of resource investment to address. So a requirements bug found in maintenance, for some systems that could be impossible to fix, just the resources it would take to get to that. It's the same with security. And so this graph is typically a software development graph, but it exactly also applies to security issues. So one of the ways that we always are advising companies to address this is to building security in really doesn't take any more effort than the things that you're already doing. So I chose to describe a waterfall methodology here, but a similar conversation could be had about agile or other methodologies. But so for instance, when you're in the requirements phase and you're talking about things like, well, what are the business needs of this system? What are the user needs? All the right people are in the room to also extend the conversation to, okay, well, what's our threat model? What are the assets that this system's going to touch? And what adversaries would be interested in those assets? So that now we move into design, we can start considering those things as part of the design. And when we look at the metrics, conceptually everything I just described sounds great. But what if we're talking about a real financial ramification that makes things more expensive and challenging? And so what we did was we went through our own work. We aggregated all the metrics from our own customers over the past 9+ years that we've been in business. And we anonymized everything, aggregated it, and what we drilled out of it was that, in fact, it is less expensive to build security in rather than bolting it on. And there's 2 areas of savings. So one area is the assessment cost. So having someone like an ISE actually help a company harden their system, it's about 90% of the cost to build it in over the life of that process versus the 100% of the cost to do a security review at the end. So that's a notable savings, but it's not mind-blowing. But what is mind-blowing is the remediation cost. And so what we found, like I said, we looked through all our own numbers, and we found that primarily when we found applications had bolted security on at the end, it was about 25 times the cost of fixing those issues than if they had just been addressed throughout the development process. And in the case of an infrastructure, it was about 300 times the cost. So again, we just need to attach a dollar value to a man-hour, and then there's your business case to the executives. So the next system that we'll talk about is the iPhone. I mentioned at the top of this talk that we were the first people to hack the iPhone. If we can all rewind in our mind back to when the iPhone first came out and how it was just the hottest product out there, and in some ways people still think it is one of the hottest consumer electronics products, but when it first came out, I mean, it changed everything. And so for that reason, we wanted to be part of that. And so we started looking at, well, how can we be first out of the gate to break this system when it comes to market? And there will probably be lots of others. So our approach was, what we did, we looked at, we focused on the Safari web browser. So our hypothesis was that the mobile experience, which was one of the crucial elements of what the iPhone improved upon for the user experience, was making the beautiful mobile web browsing experience. We figured that Apple would probably take the existing Safari desktop browser and migrate it to a mobile version. And so in the weeks leading up to the release, we studied all of the vulnerabilities that were being disclosed about Safari. We identified a few that we were thinking with the priority queue of issues to be addressed by Apple's developers. We identified a few that we thought might not actually be addressed, might actually still exist in the mobile version. And so when it came out, we had a few scripts that we were already prepared to run against those, and sure enough, one of them worked. It was a buffer overflow attack, and basically what it did was when a user went to our website, a malicious website, it took administrative control over the phone. So we could do everything that the phone could do. We could add, delete, modify contacts. We could modify pictures. We could send and receive text messages. Same with emails. And actually, how we proved it, it was kind of funny. We were working with a reporter from the New York Times. The reporter was at his desk in New York, and we were in our lab in Baltimore, and sending text messages, from his phone. And of course, he was in on it, and it was fine. Nothing malicious happened out of it, but we were able to prove it. And then from there, just similar to the ExxonMobil story, where just everybody wrote about it and still write about it today. So, anybody familiar with people like Charlie Miller or some of those high profile? Yeah. So Charlie Miller is an ISE alum. He was running this project and has gone on to do great things. So what's the key takeaway here? The key takeaway is that security is an ongoing process. So what we keyed in on in this attack strategy was we keyed in on the fact that there might be some things in the development process for Apple that weren't being addressed at appropriate intervals. And we leveraged that by taking known information to create an attack. So what this graph represents is the idea that over time, a system gains in complexity. As you iterate, features are added. We're all familiar with feature creep, right? So a traditional way of looking at security assessment is as I develop, as I iterate the system, I will have security come back and be part of the process periodically over time. Some cases it's as infrequent as every 2 years. A typical assessment cycle we've seen is about a year. Problem with that is once you've had that review, mitigated any issues, and then continue to develop, the security baseline doesn't change, but the attack surfaces do. And so what we recommend to our customers is instead of something like an annual or every 2-year review cycle, look at things on a quarterly basis, or at most every 6 months. And what happens there is that, yes, as you continue to add features and functionality, you're going to expand attack surfaces, but security will be right there with it to close them back up. So again, I just suggested quadrupling, or in some cases, octupling, 8 times what security reviews companies mostly do. So what am I really asking of our customers? So we wanted to look at the data and say, are we asking them to really a huge increase in cost? And what we found actually, again, looking at all of our own data from our own customers as well as publicly available information, it's actually less expensive. It's actually less expensive to get 4 reviews a year than it is to do 1 a year. And ultimately, what that boils down to is that you're streamlining things, like you're eliminating your learning curve. If you took a developer off of building some system for a year, brought them back on, they're not going to hit the ground running. They're going to have to relearn where things stand, get reacclimated, and there's just sunk time there. And all of that gets recouped when security is engaged at a more regular interval. So one of the things that we're always recommending to our customers is trying to arm them with some key questions that they should be asking of their vendors, and that vendors should be prepared to entail as part of their sales pitch when they're trying to sell into a company. And so these questions are things like, how have you considered my assets in your system? If you want access to my assets, tell me about the threat model. What are the adversaries that you're taking into account? What design principles have you built into your development methodology? Things like defense in depth, principle of least privilege, so on and so forth. It's a good blanket question because the ones who haven't built any in will say, and the ones who have very proactively built it in will be able to answer that immediately. What sort of attack surfaces does your system introduce to my company, whether it's my own system or my infrastructure? There's nothing wrong with admitting that a feature is an attack surface. As a matter of fact, ignoring that a feature is an attack surface is a weakness. What sort of testing has been done during development, and at what periods? Have you been doing those just a Nessus scan and just gotten back some reports and then done anything with those? Or is it a more intensive manual white box type review that's really identifying and mitigating those vulnerabilities? And then once the system is deployed, what sort of review are you doing on an ongoing basis? How often are you doing it? What type of review is it? So that's pretty much everything. This is the recap of the takeaways that we talked about. I just want to close with just a couple things about ISE and ways that if you're interested, you guys might be able to get involved. So at DEF CON, we are hosting a big contest. So I talked about how routers suck. And we are in partnership with the EFF. We're hosting a contest at DEF CON to take a bunch of routers and break the shit out of them. And so the point is, we know we're going to verify that all of this research by ISE and by other companies that has been handed to the manufacturers of what they need to fix still exists. Those issues are still here. So we're going to, in a high-profile way, put mud back on their face. But we're also hopefully going to identify new ones, and it should be just a fun, cool experience. So if you want to get involved, you can either, my email's on the next slide, you can either email me and I'll get you synced up, or if you go to sohopelesslybroken.com, sohopelesslybroken.com, that was the name of our original talk at Black Hat last year, or at DEF CON last year. And so it's, what's that? I still can't hear. Oh, okay. So that's the DEF CON thing. There's another study that we're doing that this is actually the first time that we've talked about it in a public way about ways that people outside of ISE might be able to get involved. We see a crisis on the horizon in the healthcare field, both patient data, but also patient health. You can create physical harm through a digital attack today, and we want to get out in front of trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so what we did, this was several months ago, we went around to a bunch of CISOs of a bunch of hospitals, and we asked the question, what would it take to secure your hospital? We understand it's probably a huge number, and it's probably a huge number of both financial resources as well as time resources, and you probably don't want to have any downtime, and I get it. But what is that big, scary number? No one knows. And so we're right now doing a study to investigate that. So we're hopefully later this summer, we will be having a report that says, whatever the number is, if it's $10 million, whatever, at least now healthcare systems can be empowered to say, this is what we have to do to get from where we are today to where we need to be to protect all of us in this room, our families, our loved ones. There's one more thing that isn't actually on here. We are doing a boot camp too. There was a question in the last session about, how do I learn, I'm paraphrasing now, I believe what you said, how do I take these issues and learn how to translate them back to my company? How do I sell it internally? And we're doing a boot camp that gives people to be able to, the opportunity to come work alongside our computer scientists, break systems, we'll show you how it works, and we'll show you how to talk about it to your bosses and get some internal buy-in. And then finally, we're hiring. So if you like breaking systems, if you're good at it, if you like working on a constant array of really interesting different projects, we work in everything from media and entertainment to healthcare, obviously, hospitality. We're weaponizing RFID readers for hotel locks. There would probably be a good fit for you with us. So I guess I'll wrap up there. Any questions? I guess they can be. I don't know what the logistic is of that. I can also email them to you. Yeah.
It's not a very technical one, so this might be a little bit boring, but it seems like it's relatively easy to quantify the cost of remediation when you're talking to executives. But trying to convince them of, well, say I did do it and I was exploited. If the cost of that exploit is less than the cost of the fix, it's not worth repairing in the first place.
Absolutely.
So how do you talk to them about exploring the cost of a vulnerability being exploited?
Yeah.
So they can have a number of comparisons.
Sure. So I just finished a white paper to answer that exact question. And it's pretty staggering. One of the things that I keyed in on, again, going back to Target and why it's such a great case study, is all the metrics around Target. And so when you look at what happened there, it is laughable what the preventative cost would have been compared to their exposure. So Target's exposure is estimated by all the research that I did to be, it'll probably be over $5.2 billion. Now, not to say they're going to pay all of $5.2 billion, but their potential exposure, and you say exposure to a board of directors, then that's all that they need to hear. And that's everything from, there's the response costs. I mean, the response costs alone were $61 million as of February, and we don't even know what they've been since that. $61 million, I mean, it probably would have cost less than $1 million to harden all the systems that were vulnerable in the Target situation. And $61 million, then you've got billions in litigation. They had to deal with, there's potential PCI fines, things like that. So then you talk about asset value is defined in two ways, upside to the adversary and downside to the victim. And if you look at what the potential value of those credit cards stolen, those 40 million credit cards stolen in the Target breach, what they would be worth on the black market if they were all able to be sold at the price that they're estimated based on, I'm sure you guys are following Krebs, and he broke that story and has been really following it. If you multiply that out, it's something like the full potential is $4 billion. Now, most recent reports are looking like the guys have actually sold it for, they've made about 100 million so far. Whichever number you want to look at, that is a huge carrot for an attacker. So all it's going to do is incentivize the next attacker. And so those are two different answers to your question. But the reason that when I usually talk to executives, I talk to them about how to make what you're already doing more effective and less expensive, it plays a little less into the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But once we see pushback, that's when we put this paper down. We say, okay, well, if we really want to talk about what the financial ramification is, you're absolutely right. The ramification's in not doing something. Yeah?
With regards to the Soho routers, did you test any of the alternate firmwares out there, like Lupita or
I would need to double check on that. I can send you the link. It's I don't remember the link off the top of my head. I can email you the link though if you want, and there's a page on our site that clearly articulates everything that was covered in the study.
Does that include mitigations?
There were mitigation strategies, yes. Yes.
Back on the black box versus white box analysis, in the black box, you did that first, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
You identified 4 or 5.
Yep.
Did you basically confirm those 4 or 5 and the 11 that you found in the white box?
Yeah. So there were 4 issues that we found in. I'm sorry.
No, and also, and did that help speed up the assessment? I mean, I know you said 9 hours. Did you redo the assessment for those, or did you already?
Right. So that's a really good question. So of the 4 issues we found in the black box, only 3 were actually issues. One was misunderstanding. So of those 3 issues, and like I said, 2 of them the customer already knew about, we did find those in the white box portion. The time in the black box assessment did not in any way help the white box other than the basics of familiarity with the system. But in terms of knowing how an attack worked, not at all. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it. I'll be here, and please feel free to email me.